Halloween in 2004 was my favorite night of the year. It always had been. But that year it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I was 11 years old, trick-or-treating with my cousin James and our friend Danny. It was the first Halloween our parents trusted us to go out alone, and we were determined to make it epic. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone decorated their lawns and porch lights stayed on until midnight. We'd been planning for weeks, marking the houses with the best candy. Danny even joked about bringing an extra pillowcase just in case. The night started out perfectly. By 7 p.m., the streets were bustling with kids in costumes and our bags were already half full. But as the younger kids started heading home, the streets grew quieter. That's when we noticed him. Under a flickering streetlight, a man in a clown costume stood perfectly still, leaning against the pole. His outfit was dirty, torn in places, and the makeup on his face was smeared, making his painted smile look distorted and sinister. "Cool costume," Danny said under his breath, though his voice wavered. We tried to ignore him and moved to the next house. When I glanced back, the man was gone, or so I thought. As we turned onto the next street, I saw him again. He was standing several houses down, just watching us. "He's probably just some guy messing around," James said, trying to brush it off. But none of us were laughing anymore. As we continued, his presence became impossible to ignore. He was always there, never running, never hiding, just walking slowly behind us, keeping the same distance no matter how fast we moved. At one point, Danny turned and shouted, "Hey, what do you want?" The clown didn't respond. He just tilted his head, the eerie smile on his face seeming to stretch wider. My chest tightened, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about his silence was worse than if he had shouted back. By now, the streets were almost empty. We decided to head back to Danny's house, figuring it was safer to be indoors. The walk felt endless. The sound of our footsteps on the pavement seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. Every so often I glanced back, and every time he was there. When we finally reached Danny's yard, we turned to look again, but he was gone. The relief was overwhelming. We rushed inside and locked the door, laughing nervously and trying to convince ourselves it was just a prank. Danny's mom noticed our pale faces and asked what was wrong. We told her everything, but she just chuckled. "It's Halloween," she said. "People like to scare kids." We tried to move on, dumping out our candy and joking about how scared we'd been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At 10 p.m., the doorbell rang. Danny's mom opened it and we heard her gasp. We ran to see what was happening, but no one was there. Just a single carved pumpkin sitting on the porch. Wrapped around its stem was a strip of torn fabric, red and white, just like the clown's costume. Danny's mom called the police, but they didn't take it seriously. Probably just a prank, they said. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside my window felt like him, waiting, watching. Every town has its stories. Ours revolved around the house on Hawthorne Lane, a decrepit, abandoned property that had loomed over the neighborhood for decades. Parents warned their kids to stay away, and kids dared each other to step onto the crumbling porch. No one ever stayed long. Rumor had it that the woman who lived there, Mrs. Grady, had lost her husband and son in a car accident many years ago. After that, she was never the same. Neighbors whispered that she spent her days sitting in the window, staring out at nothing, and her nights pacing the halls. Eventually, she disappeared. Some said she moved away. Others believed she was still there, hiding in the shadows. That Halloween, my friends, Mark, Lily, and I decided it was time to see for ourselves. We were 15, too old for trick-or-treating, but not old enough to ignore the thrill of a good scare. Armed with flashlights and a mixture of excitement and dread, we approached the house just as the last trick-or-treaters disappeared from the streets. The house looked even worse up close. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and thorny bushes. The air felt colder here, as if the house itself exhaled a frigid breath. The porch sagged under our weight, and every step made the wood groan loudly, like it was warning us to turn back. Mark, ever the brave one, pushed open the front door without hesitation. It wasn't locked. It swung open slowly, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell hit us immediately, a mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic. "Wow, this place is worse than I thought," Mark muttered, shining his flashlight around the living room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, leaves, and something that looked suspiciously like bones. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair facing the wall. On the chair sat a porcelain doll, its face cracked and one eye missing. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "Why is that even here?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Mark, of course, picked it up. "Maybe it's Mrs. Grady's favorite toy," he joked, holding it up to his face. "Put it down," I snapped, my unease growing. He laughed but complied, setting the doll back on the chair. The house was eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. But then from somewhere upstairs we heard it, a faint tapping sound. "Probably just a raccoon or something," Mark said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Despite every instinct telling me to leave, we decided to investigate. The staircase was narrow and steep, and every step groaned loudly as we ascended. The tapping grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking on a table. The hallway at the top of the stairs was long and dark, with doors on either side. At the end was a door slightly ajar, with a faint flickering light coming from inside. "Maybe someone's here," Lily whispered, clutching my arm. "Only one way to find out," Mark said, his flashlight aimed at the door. He pushed it open, revealing a bedroom. The walls were covered in graffiti and scratch marks, as if someone or something had clawed at them. In the center of the room was a single candle burning on the floor. Its flickering flame cast eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Above the candle, scrawled in ash, were the words, "Get out, yet." "Okay, this is officially not funny," I said, my voice shaking. Before we could react, the door slammed shut behind us. The candle's flame went out, plunging the room into total darkness. Lily screamed, and I fumbled with my flashlight, my hands trembling. When I finally managed to turn it on, the room was empty. The candle, the words on the wall, they were gone. "What the hell is going on?" Mark whispered, his bravado completely gone. We ran to the door, pulling and twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping sound started again, this time from right outside the door. It was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the silence. Suddenly the door flew open, and we didn't wait to see what was on the other side. We bolted down the hallway and back down the stairs, the tapping now following us, growing louder and faster. When we reached the living room, I glanced back. For a split second, I saw a figure at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, her pale face partially obscured by shadow. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace. We didn't stop running until we were outside. Gasping for breath, we turned to look at the house. That's when Lily pointed to the second-floor window. The candle was burning again, and standing in the window was the woman, staring down at us with an expression that sent chills through my entire body. It was 3 years ago, on Halloween night. My younger brother Max and I were left home alone to hand out candy while our parents attended a party. It wasn't unusual. Our neighborhood was quiet and safe, with families who usually wrapped up their Halloween festivities by 8 or 9 p.m. That night started like any other. Max and I sat in the living room, the candy bowl between us, taking turns answering the door. The trick-or-treaters dwindled as the hours passed. By 9 p.m., the streets were eerily silent, and we assumed the night was over. Then the doorbell rang. I hesitated before answering. It felt strange for someone to come this late. When I opened the door, 3 children stood on the porch. They weren't wearing costumes, just plain faded clothes that looked too thin for the chilly October night. Their faces were pale, almost unnaturally so, and their eyes seemed too dark, like the pupils swallowed the rest. None of them were holding candy bags. "Can we come in?" the tallest one asked. He looked about 10 years old, but his voice was flat, monotone, and emotionless, like he was reading from a script. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. "Sorry, but we're out of candy," I said, gripping the door tighter. The boy didn't move. He stared at me, his dark eyes unblinking. "We're cold," he said. "Let us in." Behind me, Max peeked out from the living room. "Why don't they have costumes?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The boy ignored Max and repeated, "Let us in." Something about the way he said it, calm yet insistent, made my stomach twist. I shook my head and closed the door, locking it immediately. My heart was racing and I couldn't explain why. I looked out the window by the door, expecting to see them walking away. But the porch was empty. They were gone. I nodded and he handed me a key without asking for any payment or information. "Did they leave?" Max asked, his voice shaky. "Tag with the number 6 etched into it," I said, though I didn't believe it. We sat back down, trying to focus on the movie we'd started earlier. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house felt wrong, like the air had grown heavier. About an hour later, there was a knock at the back door. My stomach dropped. No one ever used the back door, not neighbors, not even delivery drivers. Max and I froze, staring at each other. "Who would—" Max started, but his voice trailed off. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen and crept toward the back door, motioning for Max to stay put. My heart was pounding in my ears as I approached the door, the knife shaking slightly in my grip. I peeked through the small window in the door. No one was there. Relieved, I started to turn away, but then the knock came again, louder this time, insistent. This time, I yanked the door open, knife in hand, ready to confront whoever was there. But the porch was empty. The backyard was dark, with only the faint moonlight illuminating the fence and bushes. I stood there for a moment, scanning the yard, before slamming the door shut and locking it. The knocks didn't stop. For the next hour, they moved around the house, from the windows to the front door to the garage. Each time I looked, and each time, no one was there. Then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Max let out a small scream. "What's happening?" he whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I admitted. Though the truth was, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a coincidence. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to comfort Max, but my own fear was overwhelming. Then Max pointed to the front window. "They're back," he whispered. I shined the flashlight through the glass, and there they were. The 3 kids stood in the yard, perfectly still, staring up at the house. Their faces looked even paler in the moonlight, and their eyes were darker than the night itself. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. But they didn't move. They just stood there, unblinking, as if waiting for something. Max clung to my arm, his grip tight. "What do we do?" "We stay inside," I said, though I wasn't sure how much longer that would keep us safe. Then came the tapping. It wasn't at the door this time. It was at my bedroom window. My stomach sank. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could reach that window without a ladder. Slowly, I motioned for Max to stay in the living room as I crept upstairs, flashlight in hand. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as I approached the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. When I pulled it back, I nearly dropped the flashlight. The tallest boy was there, his face pressed against the glass. His pale skin looked almost translucent in the moonlight, and his black eyes bore into mine. He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that revealed sharp, jagged teeth. "Let us in," he whispered, his voice muffled by the glass. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, he was gone. I ran back downstairs, grabbed Max, and locked us both in the bathroom. We huddled there until the first light of dawn, too afraid to move or make a sound. When our parents came home the next morning, we tried to explain what happened, but they didn't believe us. "Probably just a Halloween prank," my dad said, though his tone wasn't convincing. But when I went to get the morning paper, I found a note taped to the front door. It read, "Thanks for letting us in." To this day, I can't explain what happened, but every Halloween, I feel like they're still out there, waiting for someone else to let them in.